everyone, and once again, welcome to the Aquatic Life Conference. I am Dr. Kikiokwe Oluwarore. You can call me Kiki, and I'll be handling this next session, which will be on new research in aquatic animal welfare. Just to briefly introduce myself, I'm a veterinarian, and I have experiences in animal welfare and One Health programming, research, and nonprofit management. And in addition to my work, either co-founding or consulting for animal welfare organizations, I'm also a board member of the Aquatic Life Institute. So I'm very happy to be here. And once again, I'm happy to be a moderator for this session, and welcome. So a few housekeeping reminders for attendees who are with us currently. We would mute you upon entry, and we expect that your cameras are off. And also, please feel free to post your questions in the question and answer box once we start the panel session soon. And then please note that every session is being recorded. And lastly, we expect respectful and productive discussions, and we have zero tolerance for any harassment or discrimination of any kind. And this session would run for the next 50 minutes to an hour. So feel free, relax, and enjoy the session. And I'll also take a brief moment to introduce our panelists. We have with us two officers from Wolfam, Gautier Ruber-Rollis and Priscilla Dorbant, who are both farm animal welfare officers at Dorbam and Wolfam rather. Gautier particularly has a background in animal behavior and welfare science, and he specializes in fish welfare. And then secondly, we have Dr. Ray Delnapolis, who works with Animal Kingdom Foundation, and he's also the division chief at Quezon City Veterinary Department. And we then have Walter Sanchez Suarez, who works with Mercy for Animals, and he is an animal welfare scientist. He has a degree in veterinary medicine, a master's in philosophy, and a PhD in animal welfare, animal behavior, welfare, and neuroscience. So you can see that we're pretty much in good company with regards to the kind of panels that we have. We'll be discussing this discussion on new research in aquatic animal welfare. So I'm going to dive in right into starting with discussing about who decides research direction. Now, I have done I've of course visited research journals and the rest of them a couple of times, particularly ResearchGate, to search for articles or research work papers on aquatic animal welfare. And I have seen quite a lot of information on ethics, on environmental enrichment, on welfare assessments, and even some on the role of the World Organization for Animal Health on aquatic animal welfare. So I want to ask, maybe I should start with Walter, who decides research direction? Are there any particular events or any particular happenings that kind of stimulate and help to stimulate specific research in specific areas in aquatic animal welfare? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, my thoughts are that aquaculture as such is a type of industrial farming. So as I wrote about before, we have lots of examples coming from terrestrial animals about what works and what doesn't work. So it's very important to start looking at what's happening there to prevent doing the same mistakes, to learn from the experiences that we have gathered in that other realm. Mm-hmm. And also, I think we have to really look at the big picture of what we are doing here to these animals. They are very different from us. They live in very different environments. And the reality is that we still need to know lots about them that we scientists haven't yet unveiled. So, so my first thought is that any particular kind of activity should be guided by what science, the evidence that science provides. And obviously aquaculture, there is lots of vested interest there with, it's a very powerful industry, and it's going faster than what it should in that regard. and that of course put lots of animals at their welfare at risk, as we know and we will be talking about during this session. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yes, absolutely. Maybe we'll I will have some thoughts, just a few minutes of thoughts from Priscilla and Gautier, and then we can dive into the presentations.
Okay, so can you hear us?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay. On our side, so the question was put aside on the orientation, the direction of research, right? So generally speaking, I think that the direction of the research done within academia, not within advocacy organizations, is mostly determined by the needs of the industry rather than welfare targets. But the things are slowly changing, however, because, for example, in the last national plan for the European maritime fisheries and aquaculture subsidies at EU level, at national level, several countries, including France, included animal welfare targets for the first time, which does provide some kind of funding to fund welfare-focused research. And this is largely thanks to the European Commission strategy guidelines for sustainable aquaculture released a few years ago, sorry, which for the first time included welfare as a target, as a target of European aquaculture. And I think that's high level, this type of high level takes from like politicians, decision bodies like the European Commission can really have a big impact on where the academic research is going. And regarding organization, however, we make our decisions about which research topics are important, more based on strategic thinking about what can be implemented. And also, I think that that animal welfare organizations are in a position sometimes to do research on areas which that academia usually leave out because it may conflict a little bit more with economic interests of the industry.
Great, thank you. And we will start right now with the presentation. So I would want Gautier and Priscilla to start with the presentations.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen.
That's fine.
All right, so are you seeing our presentation right now?
Yes.
Okay, fine. So I leave the floor to my colleague who's going to start off.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So Gautier and I are going to present to you the results of the work we did on human slaughter for farm fish, which are the following. You have the rainbow trout, Atlantic salmon, European sea bass, and gillhead sea bream. To assess the humaneness of slaughter methods, we used a welfare hazard analysis methodology. We identified 12 welfare hazards frequently involved at the time of slaughter, which are exposure to noxious chemicals, immediateness of the loss of consciousness, stunning failure rates, risk of recovery of consciousness, air exposure, high or extreme densities, handling, poor water quality, tissue damage, post-tuned electrical shock, which means that the fish experience an electrical shock while being fully conscious without immediately losing consciousness. We also have the thermal shock and reliance on worker skills. And for each welfare hazard, we made a grading system. We attributed marks from A to B, with A being the best mark. We don't have the time to explain in details how it works here, but generally speaking, the idea is that we compare each slaughter method based on the marks they obtain for each welfare hazard. Now, we are going to present to you with the stunning methods that we plan to ask to the different stakeholders to avoid and the one that we want to recommend to them. Here you have the list of methods to avoid. You have the bleeding without prior stunning, the asphyxia, the live immersion in ice slurry, About the story, the loss of consciousness is not immediate, and this method is associated with thermal shock and extreme densities. Concerning the CO2 exposure, again, the loss of consciousness is not immediate, and this method is associated with suffering. We put in this list the manual percussive stunning and the manual burn spiking. Those both methods are associated with high failure rate, and we assume that the spiking induces a higher failure rate than the percussive stunning method, as it requires more precision to be performed. And those both methods are associated with air exposure and involve handling. We also have the automatic percussive stunning without human staff. You have the picture in the bottom right. In this method, fish swim through the system until they reach cylinders, where they receive a blow to the head delivered by a piston, which causes a loss of consciousness. And this method is associated with high failure rates due to the fish not being positioned correctly when they arrive, or due to the system not accommodating precisely to the side of each fish, which makes the piston hit the fish on the wrong spot. In this list, we also have 3 electrical methods. We have the dry batch electrical stunning method, which consists to put the fish in a batch without water, and the wall of the tank acts as electrode. We also have the dry prod electrical stunning, which consists to use a stick-shaped electrode. You have the illustration in the middle of the picture. No, you have the picture in the middle, sorry. And you can use this method with or without water. The 2 first methods are associated with air exposure and risk of persistent electrical shock. And also, those 3 electrical methods are associated with high failure rates. About the methods that we want to recommend, we have the in-water electrical pipeline. In this method, fish are streamed through the pipe with water until they reach an electrical field where they receive an electrical shock, which causes a loss of consciousness. We think that this method is the best electrical method currently available. And the failure rate is very low. The loss of consciousness is immediate. There is no handling, no air exposure, and however, there is still a risk of recovery of consciousness, but it depends on the setting. And the main drawback of this method is the price, because it's very, very expensive. And at the bottom of the slide, we have the semi-automatic percussive stunning method, which is quite similar to the methods that I showed you before. The difference is that there are workers positioned at the entrance of the device. They are here to sort fish according to the size. They push them in the right position, the head first, in different cylinders, which also have different size, which allow to avoid misturn. And the workers could also verify the loss of consciousness in the downstream. So it's so the stunning rate is acceptable. And this method also in this method the loss of consciousness is immediate, but there are still some drawbacks, like the risk of recovery of consciousness depending on the setting, like the pressure. There is also this method requires handling. It could be associated with air exposure, but it depends on the machine design. And this method is always associated with high density. This method is only available for salmon and large trout and cannot be used in portion trout, and is not available for sea bass and sea bream.
And actually, the next method in our ranking is a combination of the methods my colleague just presented, i.e. you first have fish go through in-water pipeline electrical stunning, and then you submit them to semi-automatic percussive stunning. And the benefit of this combination is that you sort of get the best of both worlds by eliminating the drawbacks associated with each method when they're used separately. Generally speaking, stunning can either be reversible, meaning that the fish can recover consciousness after a while, or it can be irreversible, meaning that fish are dead and cannot recover consciousness. And for electrical and percussive stunning, the reversibility of the stem depends on settings like electrical parameters or pressure parameters. For percussive stunning, the parameters associated with irreversible stunning may damage the aspect of the head of the fish, but it doesn't affect the quality of the fillet, so it can be used without too much problem by the industry in practice. However, when it comes to electrical stunning, the settings leading to irreversible stunning are associated with higher risks of carcass damage in the form of blood spotting. Therefore, although we prefer producers to use irreversible electrical settings, in practice, they're likely to prefer using flesh quality friendly reversible settings. Therefore, adding an irreversible semi-automatic percussive stunning after an in-water pipeline reversible electrical stunning can eliminate the risk of recovery of consciousness that comes with flesh quality friendly electrical parameters. And because fish are unconscious when they leave the electrical pipeline, they will not suffer from the air exposure, handling, and crowding associated with semi-automatic percussive stunning. In addition, combining two systems further reduces the failure rates to almost zero. However, this combination is very expensive and is only available for large Atlantic salmon on large trout. And for knowledge, only one company called Scottish Sea Farms already use it commercially in Scotland. Then we also recommend two other types of electrical methods. First one, as you can see at the top right corner, is called head-to-body electrical stunning. For this form, fish are put on a conveyor belt, which moves them forward until they make contact with overhanging metallic strips, which act as electrodes, delivering an electrical shock, knocking the fish unconscious. And this method has a relatively good success rate of 95 to 99%, so loss of consciousness is immediate. As for all electrical stunning methods, there may be some risk of recovery of consciousness depending on the settings that you use. And the drawbacks are there is a little bit of air exposure, and there are also moderate risks of pristine electrical shock depending on system design. The thing is that if the fish arrives tail first instead of arriving head first into the system, they may endure a pristine electrical shock during the time their tail is in contact with an electrode until the head also makes contact with an electrode. However, to prevent this from happening, you can use an additional system at the entrance of the stunner called a rectifier, which you can see a picture of in the top left corner, and which is a system which makes it so that fish arrived head first at a rate of 98 to 99%. At the bottom right of the picture, you can see in-water batch electrical stunning, which is another method we recommend. It consists in putting the fish into a tank filled with water, and the walls of the tank act as electrodes. And therefore, once the tank is filled, you activate the electrodes, which deliver an electrical shock which stuns the fish unconscious. And the stunning success rate is 95 to 99%, so loss of consciousness is immediate. As for all electrical stunning methods, you may have some risk of recovery of consciousness depending on the settings you use. And the main drawbacks of this are that this method is associated with high density, relatively poor water quality, and there are moderate risk of pristine electrical shock depending on system design. The important thing is to use wide plate electrodes that span the whole width of the tank, and not just a few metallic strips, a few thin metallic strips, which aren't as effective. And you can see that head-to-body electrical stunning is moderately expensive, with price ranges around 45,000 euros. But in-water batch electrical stunning can be relatively cheap, with price ranging from 900 euros to 10,000 euros. And although we recommend several acceptable methods, we do not think that all of the methods we just presented are the same in terms of welfare outcome, which is the reason why we came up with a ranking of acceptable methods. At the very top of the methods we recommend is a combination of in-water pipeline electrical stunning followed by semi-automatic percussive stunning. At the second rank, we have in-water pipeline electrical stunning when it is used on its own. At the third rank, we have head-to-body electrical stunning. And at the fourth rank, we have two methods. First one being semi-automatic percussive stunning with human staff. and the second one being in-water batch electrical stunning carried out in fresh water. In addition, we also came up with some cross-cutting recommendations. One issue is that prior to slaughter and transportation, fish are usually fasted, on the one hand to preserve water quality throughout transport, and on the other hand for food safety related reasons. While fasting is necessary, the problem is that it is often too long and negatively impacts fish welfare. Therefore, we recommend to keep fasting duration to the minimum time needed to empty the gas. For salmonids, we believe that maximum fasting duration should not exceed 20 degree days for fish under 500 grams of body weight, and that it should not exceed 30 degree days for fish above 500 grams of body weight. For sea bream and sea bass, we recommend not to exceed 55 degree days of fasting. If you don't know, degree days is like a unit of time which also takes into account the impact of water temperature. And we also want staff to perform consciousness checks on fish after stunning prior to bleeding, ideally systematically or at least on a risk-based sample. And if signs of consciousness are present, we want staff to carry out emergency stunning by using a manual pneumatic percussive gun as a backup stunning system. And finally, it's also important to quickly apply an efficient killing method after stunning. It's especially important to do so after a reversible stunning in order to prevent the recovery of consciousness. And throughout our research, we also identified some methods which had some potential to be humane, but that we feel are too uncertain to be recommended for the time being. Within this category, there is chemical anesthesia with either eugenol, immersion in nitrogen-saturated water for rainbow trout and sea bream, and immersion in carbon monoxide-saturated water performed in a progressive manner. And the main problem is that for all of these methods, there is a lack of EEG data, i.e. we don't have really studies to monitor the brain activity throughout the process. In addition, none of these methods are immediate, and we do have doubts about whether or not the time leading up to unconsciousness would or would not involve some distress for the fish in with the systems. So thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you, Priscilla and Gauthier, for that wonderful presentation. And I can imagine how useful this would be, and people will be willing to get more information, particularly those in the industry and related professionals. And I hope that attendees are noting down their questions and putting them in the chat box so that we can collect them right after the entire round of presentations, and then have our presenters answer the questions asked. So I'll now move to Walter to make his presentation. Walter, you can go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. So, well, good afternoon, and many thanks for attending this presentation today. Today I'm going to talk about the importance of paying attention to the welfare at the individual level in captive fishes, which is still a neglected topic, especially in the aquaculture realm. This talk will be mostly based on a very recent paper that my colleague Laurie Torgerson-White, who is the director of research at the Farm Sanctuary in the US, and I published on this very topic. Considering the very little time that we have today, I will skip the usual slide presentation and instead briefly introduce you to the main questions that are discussed in this article. But first of all, and especially for those of you who are not very familiar with the scientific concept of animal welfare, I will briefly explain what we mean by welfare. An already classic definition provided by Professor Donald Broom regards the welfare of an animal, for instance, if we are talking about a female, as her state as this animal attempts to cope with her environment. A few years ago, Professor Marian Dawkins complemented this definition by stating that the welfare equation is composed of two main aspects or components: the degree of health experienced by an individual and the extent to which this individual is provided with the conditions that she likes and wants. As you can see, these definitions show that welfare is first and foremost an individual attribute. Thus, the welfare of an animal can be regarded as the emotional experience that results from her interactions with the environment over time, and which exists on a continuum from negative to positive. So, what do we know about fishes as individual personalities? Well, first of all, it is important to understand what we mean by personalities. From a scientific and operational viewpoint, personalities can be defined as forms of behavior that are repeatable across time and contexts. There is a growing body of research showing that fishes possess different individual personalities. Indeed, the research into individuality in fishes shows that there is individual variation in cognitive capacities, emotion, and preferences, all of which are linked to what we call personality. The ability to learn faster or slower, and to prefer and avoid different conditions and elements that fishes face as part of their environments are essential aspects that conform the personalities of these animals. All these factors are interrelated and shaped not only by their genetics, but also by the different situations that they experience since they are born. For instance, scientific research shows that in some contexts, some individuals are more aggressive than others, or that some fishes are more proactive towards the environment than others, who express more reactive behavior. As a result of this, different individuals experience different degrees of welfare, depending on whether the tools they are equipped with are more or less apt to successfully adapt to the conditions they face. So, and similarly to what happens in other animal groups, fish populations are conformed by a plethora of individual animals characterized by their own individual needs and preferences, all of which play a key role in regard to the welfare of these animals. All these aspects that I have just mentioned become of utmost relevance when considering the case of aquaculture. For this industry is characterized by scenarios where very large numbers of animals are kept together at high stocking densities in artificial and typically barren environments that often represent a sharp contrast to the conditions these animals adapted to through lengthy evolutionary processes. Firstly, it is important to stress that the welfare assessment protocols favored by the aquaculture industry typically focus on health-related aspects and are thus inadequate to evaluate more subtle elements related to the preferences and needs of these animals, which, as I mentioned before, are a key piece of the welfare equation. In other words, good health represents just a necessary but not sufficient component of good welfare. Sorry. On top of that, given the very large numbers of animals involved in these farming scenarios, and also the fact that these animals typically live underwater, for practical and financial reasons, these protocols usually gather those health-related pieces of evidence from a small subset of the population, with the goal to later extrapolate these findings to the whole group of animals that are kept together. As we can see, this statistical approach is prone to misinterpret the health conditions experienced by many animals whose distinct personalities might not be correctly represented by the small samples collected. However, the most relevant point here is that we currently lack the tools to properly monitor the welfare of these animals under standard farming conditions. The reality is that even if the industry wanted to monitor the welfare of every farm individual, provided we have the knowledge regarding the conditions needed for provisioning these animals with good welfare in captivity, which unfortunately is not the case for most of the more than 400 species of fish currently farmed, the very large numbers of fishes required to make industrial aquaculture systems profitable render the technical tools that we currently have ineffective for this task. The good news is that we have the possibility to make progress with answering these questions by focusing on other scenarios, which in turn must guide and shape what's possible under farming conditions. Experimental settings do actually provide us with the opportunity to further investigate not only the different types of personalities and its related welfare needs that conform the different fish species, but also to understand which aspects and conditions, including group composition and stocking densities, genetics, and elements related to environmental design, such as colors, sounds, shelter structures, water conditions, etc., work best in order to maximize the probability that every individual is provided with good welfare. For instance, considering the low degree of domestication of most farm species, well, I will skip this paragraph because probably I'm running out of time and I don't want to limit the time further. Well, so I will conclude now. Similarly, these settings allow for further developing technical tools, these experimental settings, I mean, and protocols that are truly able to effectively monitor the welfare of these animals over the whole lifespan, taking the more holistic work of experienced and progressive zoo caretakers at the gold standard we should aim at. Monitoring technologies, visual, acoustic, including devices capable of measuring and tracking physiological variables and behavior, are promising in this regard, but they must be further developed to become non-invasive or minimal invasive and progressively able to keep better track of the different animals, even when large numbers of animals are involved. So I hope I'm not going over time, and to conclude this very short talk, I will read a paragraph of the paper that I think summarizes very well all these ideas. As we continue to tackle this challenge, we might find that for some species or life stages, the target of individual high welfare in captivity is simply not possible or profitable. Yet, the number of fishes who are being farmed is only growing, which means that the number of individuals who are left behind by welfare assessments that largely utilize group-level welfare indicators is also growing. There is an urgent need to make progress with identifying the inputs necessary to provide good welfare for the variety of individuals who are kept in captive conditions around the world. Thank you.
Oh. Okay. Oh, thought I was muted. Thank you so much, Walter, for that wonderful presentation, which you talked a lot about examining the current state of welfare assessment, particularly at individual levels of fish, instead of having the general welfare assessment that we do at group levels. Wonderful insights are being shared, and I would also, be receiving questions for Walter from here on, so that we can have a robust conversation about this. But to start with, there are already questions for Gautier and Priscilla, and I will go ahead with one of them. So somebody is asking that if producers adopt some of these stunning methods, could it also lead to lower stocking densities as more care needs to be taken with each animal?
Not sure I entirely understood the question. Can you repeat, please?
Okay, I should read it. I should reread it.
Yes, please.
Okay, all right then. So it says, if producers adopt some of these stunning methods, could it also lead to lower stocking densities because more care needs to be taken with each animal? That's the question.
I don't really think that using one of the stunning methods would have an impact on stocking density directly, because it's usually like fish are usually brought to a lairage tank before they are slaughtered, or for dependent systems, or in some or for this is the case at least for rainbow trout, and for salmon and sea bass and sea bream. Usually fish are either slaughtered directly on a boat nearby to the sea cages, or they are first transferred with a boat up to a slaughtering pontoon. And I don't really think that there would really be an impact between the choice of slaughter methods and stocking density. What I do suspect, though, is that because the price ranges of the method we recommend are quite broad, I suspect that small-scale farms, which are more likely to have low stocking densities, are probably going to only be able to invest in the cheapest available recommended methods, like in-water batch electrical stunning, rather than buying very expensive methods like the combination of in-water pipeline electrical stunning combined with semi-automatic pressure system.
Okay, I think following up on what you just said about the cost, there is actually a question about this, and the person is asking that all of this technology which you have presented in your in your presentation comes with a very heavy price tag, which may not be accessible to artisanal farmers who catch more than 50% of all the wild fish globally. So what are your thoughts on what to do with this conundrum where we have, this technology comes with heavy price tags, and then most people really can't afford, a lot of artisanal farmers really can't afford this. What would be your recommendations or solutions to addressing this issue?
As mentioned, the price ranges of the system we recommend are quite broad. The cheapest one available within our recommended methods is in-water batch electrical steaming. And the cheapest systems are only around like 1,000 euros. So I believe that these systems can be available even probably in some middle to low income countries and for very small production. And for cases where even such low investment is already too much, actually one method that we put within the list of methods to avoid is manual purchase steaming. We put it in the list of methods to avoid because we believe that at least in France, farmers are able to invest in other methods, but maybe in other areas where there is very low ability to invest, this method is probably better than nothing and quite easy to implement very cheaply. And if you do use manual purchase steaming, it's better if you can use a pneumatic gun rather than just like a wooden stick. And pneumatic guns can be still relatively cheap also. So this is the solution we would put forward for farms which do not have a lot of ability to invest.
Great. I think a follow-up question from me would be that, do you think that over the next few years we will continue to see more cost-effective methods come up, and cost-effective methods are equally highly impactful? Do you think we'll continue to see such improvement in this technology over the coming years?
I don't really think that the improvement is going to be about the cost too much. Maybe it will be. Maybe it will happen. It could happen for in-water pipeline stunners because with if like the production scales up, maybe the cost will reduce a little bit. But I don't think we can really expect a very, very big drop in the price ranges. I think the improvements that are probably going to come in the future are probably focus more on the specific electrical settings used for utilities, because for the time being, there is some information about which settings to use, but it's not very, very precise. And the effectiveness of the methods can probably be improved by doing more research about which are the optimal electrical settings to use, especially for sea bass and sea bream, for whom there are less available information about settings than for salmonids.
Right. Thank you, Gautier. And a question for you, Walter. Could you share a little more about your monitoring and technology processes? Oh, sorry. Could you share a little more about monitoring, technology, and processes for the welfare assessments that you have mentioned at the individual level?
Well, I mean, obviously, those monitoring tools clearly depend on knowing what these animals need and want, on top of the ability to measure their health, as I mentioned before. So that knowledge must guide what we can do with these monitoring devices and must shape how we utilize these monitoring devices. There are devices like, passive integrated transponders, or, acoustic telemetry, or, I mean, there are devices that have been used for several years, and they can collect valuable information about these animals, physiological, behavioral measures. Obviously, taking these technologies to standard fish farming, considering the huge number of animals involved, it's a challenge, because some of these technologies are not really able to provide all that information for so many individuals. But still, I mean, I think it's a very good question, but as I mentioned before, I mean, we must use these technologies not just to gather information, but we must know what information we need to gather and track over time in order to evaluate whether these animals are really experiencing good welfare. As I mentioned before, measuring health is easier, but if we're considering, as I mentioned, that there are more than 400 species of fish farm, and we have very little knowledge about many of them, about the environments they need, about, and if we add into the equation now that aspect of individuality, what the different individuals need, what if we enrich, for instance, one environment with a certain, substrate or demand feeders, or, I mean, those elements will affect different individuals with different personalities differently, and will impact their welfare, might benefit some, but might really impair the welfare of many others. And that's a huge challenge when we're thinking about how to build those environments. So yeah, I'm thinking to try holistically to answer holistically to your question. But so the technologies are there and are being developed and perfection, but still, I think the huge challenge is to really unveil what these animals need in order to experience good welfare in captivity.
Okay, great. Maybe I also have a follow-up question on your presentation. So talking about the assessment at individual level, yeah. In terms of the resources needed and the tools needed to perform such very detailed level of assessment at that level, what do you think that would mean to a regular fish farmer? I mean, whether it's from a high-income country or from a low-income country, what can you say about the feasibility, the cost effectiveness, the technology needed to perform such very detailed assessment, and even the time that would be needed to be able to conduct such assessment? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to say that the idea when writing this paper was to focus on what fish, we tried to think from a fish viewpoint, not from the farmer or other stakeholders viewpoint. So
okay,
and to me that's integral. I mean, that's how we should think about other animals, as scientists, animal welfare scientists, when we're trying to provide them with the right conditions or to evaluate welfare in a meaningful way. So obviously that is to say that, I mean, this approach is very far from what we are currently experiencing in fish farming. I mean, obviously, if you tell this to farmers, they could think, okay, that's fully impossible. The question again is that we really need to understand, I mean, if we're going to keep these animals in captivity and if people are going to farm them, we don't really know which genetics, group compositions, number of animals. I mean, there are so many interacting factors there that we need to explore from a scientific viewpoint in order to understand. And that was the final paragraph when we wrote that. Obviously, we had in mind that obviously if you have a net pen with like more than 100,000 animals there, fully unenriched, I mean, that's very, very far from what we really know. I mean, that's not that's the industry's interest, but obviously it doesn't look, it's highly likely that many of these animals are experiencing very poor welfare, other than we can measure through health assessments that already show that many animals are experiencing poor welfare. So yeah, I mean, I'm probably talking, like a bit too much about, but the point here is that everything should start from like labs and experimental settings, understand what these animals need, and maybe then extrapolate that to farming. And we could find, or we might find, that it is possible to farm these animals in meaningful ways in which they are provided with good welfare throughout their lives, most of them, and maximize that probability. But at this moment, we don't have that information. As I said before, the aquaculture industry is far ahead from of what we really know regarding the welfare of these animals.
Okay, thank you, Walter. And one more question, and I mean that's for both of you, Walter, and Gautier and Priscilla. Now I'm going to be asking a question that talks about like the broader areas of research in aquatic animal welfare. And I read one of your papers, Walter, that you wrote in 2020 on From Land to Water, something about taking fish welfare serious or important. I've forgotten the exact words, but there you mentioned that our knowledge of fish welfare is still very poor and it's still very scarce, and we don't really know much. So do you think this is still valid in 2022? And what do you think? Which of the areas in aquatic animal welfare currently are like the most neglected so far?
Well, so I think I talked about that a bit in the previous question, but I mean, obviously 2 years, considering the magnitude of the question we're trying to answer, is a very short time. Scientists, I mean, fish welfare scientists are working very hard, and they have been working for many years. But if we think about and this is something we talk about in that paper, if we think about the very large number of species that they live underwater, that they are very alien to us in many aspects, and all those challenges make progress slower than, for instance, with terrestrial animals, where it is easier somehow to understand what these animals need in order to experience good welfare. So well, not to, I don't want to talk too much about that, but I mean, again, there's so much work to do at labs and experimental settings. Yeah.
Okay, so for you, Priscilla and Gautier, I was very happy to see that your research is something that, even though we can have publications from it, but also something that has a real world application to it and can be adaptable to like real world scenarios and real world situations. So this is very impressive. And how do you think that we continue to have research that doesn't just end up with publications in journals and can actually be utilized to make impacts and be effective at the field, at the ground level, at for people that are really doing the real work with regards to fish welfare on the ground? How do you think we can make this happen?
I think something which is very important is to have people in a position to make the information communicate from academic research to producers. And I think generally speaking, NGOs are in a very good position to do that. And especially for humane slaughter, we at Well Farm, we are planning to reach out to very many different stakeholders, be it producers, but also agri-food companies and fish transformation companies, to talk with them about humane slaughter and what is the newest science. And I also believe that maybe outside of animal NGOs, maybe some other entities are also in a position of translating the science into recommendations which are more easy to understand for producers. Also welfare counseling companies. We have a few animal welfare companies in France. For the time being, they don't work too much on fish, but maybe in the future they could start. And I also think veterinarians should also have maybe developed some kind of welfare counseling activity on the side of fish health activity. And I also think that something which is very important is to have translations of the science in each country's language. For example, in France, almost all the research is only published in English, and fish farmers, even people working in fish farming companies, many of them here in France do not speak English, or they don't speak English that well. And so the language barrier is also, I think, a problem to communicate the science.
Great. Okay, so we have just about 2 to 3 minutes to sneak in just one last important question. How do we get research in aquatic animal welfare, particularly neglected ones? How do we get to secure more funding or recognition for these areas? What are your thoughts on this? Just a last word from both of you on this, and then we can wrap up the interesting panel conversation. Do you want to go first, Walter? Okay.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I think having experienced both academia and now working within the non-profit animal protection sector, I think things have changed positively in that regard, and many scientists, typically animal welfare scientists, were conditioned financially by having to collaborate very tightly with, or having to address the interests of the producers. I mean, that was typically the case for many species. Now the scenario is changing, and luckily sources, philanthropic sources are changing the game in that regard. We are starting to go for the very big questions and trying to understand what's necessary to really improve the lives of these animals. I mean, not just putting patches to things that need to be addressed too, but we're not that ambitious. So I think we're seeing, and we will see a larger shift in the coming years in terms of scientists being funded by also philanthropic sources, and that per se will bring more recognition to the relevance of these big questions, and hopefully even more institutional and also funds coming from the industry will also collaborate in the future in these efforts to support all the scientists trying to address these very crucial questions.
Thank you. Priscilla, Gautier?
I think actually we agree with what was said. I think it's best to have, if we can also find some philanthropic sources of funding to fund research, which sometimes the industry is a bit reluctant to fund. For example, earlier you talked about neglected research areas. For example, for salmonids, something which I think is very neglected is the study of the welfare implications of water depth available in wasteways, which is something that the industry doesn't want to look at because it would mean very massive investments if they find out that water depth is not deep enough, for example. And so I do think it's important to try to secure funding unrelated to the industry to try to do this research, but we also have to collaborate with the industry to because they're also willing to fund some research on certain aspects which are more aligned with their economical interests or easier to implement, things like environmental enrichment or, for example, water quality and fish welfare is also very much related to like fish health and productivity. And so it can align more with the industry's interests. So basically trying to secure both philanthropic funding to fund like research that the industry might be a little bit reluctant to fund, and collaborating with the industry to fund questions that even the industry is interested to answer.
Great. Thank you so much, Walter, Priscilla, Gautier, for being wonderful and I mean, giving us so much information and also giving us so much things to reflect on even after this conversation. And this session has ended and we can conveniently move to the next panel, which will be discussing updates from the Aquatic Animal Alliance Coalition members. So, and this is goodbye for this panel from me here. And yeah. Let's continue the conversation.